Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this third webinar in the current series. This webinar is supported by the International Association for Human Rights Education. And I want everybody to be aware of that because I want everybody to know about this association, and which was set up last year to bring together many of us who are working in human rights education. So I hope that you will feel it's your association and will be ready to join it. This webinar we don't charge for, but there is an annual membership fee for the association of £50 GBP. And we really encourage you to join our association, and in doing so, you are not only given the opportunity to network with others working in the field of human rights education globally, and to have priority access to occasions like this, and to have a special discount at our annual conference, but you're also supporting the journal Human Rights Education Review, which is the journal which the paper we're going to hear from this evening was published in. So I'd like you to bear that in mind and to consider joining, please. You can join by going to our website, which is shown on the slide in front of you, and hopefully we can also put that into the messaging of this webinar. So that's all I want to say in terms of an introduction to International Association for Human Rights Education. And to add, we are having a conference in London on the 19th of April 2024, to which you are all invited. And I encourage you to have a look at that and see the excellent speakers that we have got there. We've got also some 40-odd presenters, and the call for papers is now closed. If, however, you are seeking funds to join the International Association of Human Rights Education conference in London, we may be able to accommodate you if you wish to present a paper. So please get in touch with us if that's the case. Okay, that's my advertisement for this evening. And now I'm very, very pleased to introduce this evening's speaker. Our speaker is Piers von Berg, who's a senior lecturer in law at Birmingham City University in the UK. His work is interdisciplinary in nature. It focuses on both human rights law and human rights education. And he's particularly interested in how we might facilitate the participation of young people as citizens and as rights holders. He's had an interesting career so far. He's worked in Central Asia and the Caucasus on such citizenship education projects, and he's also practiced at the bar of England and Wales. So he's a lawyer. So we're very, very pleased to welcome you, Piers, and we look forward to hearing this interdisciplinary research you've engaged in.
Is it possible to have a vodka and ice and juice?
We have someone who's not put on their mic.
Okay. Two?
Vibeke, I think. Can we silence her, please? Thank you. Okay, Piers, if you're ready to go ahead.
Thank you very much, Audrey, and the association, and also Hugh, for the invitation to speak today at this international event. So my name is Piers von Berg, and I work at Birmingham City University in the United Kingdom. And I'm going to be talking today about transformative human rights education at university within a citizenship education project. So this research project that I'll be talking about looks at the theme of how we can organize activities and experiences within our classrooms that can challenge and change the way in which we see others and ourselves as members of a political community. In particular, whether we can come to perceive others as people with stories, identity, and ultimately dignity, the core of human rights. I'm going to be focusing mainly on the research methodology and its accompanying findings as a way in which us as researchers act as teachers within the research space. And I'm going to question whether this leads to ideas of academic citizenship, where we can act as not just researchers and teachers, but also learners ourselves, that the process can be transformative for the researcher. So to trace my journey into this work, as Audrey mentioned, I started working in international technical assistance in the Caucasus, and this is Maiden Tower in Baku, Azerbaijan. And I was very lucky to be there. I was very privileged to be part of an international team working on citizenship education. And I was able to be there as a person with an undergraduate degree in international relations, coming from a Western country in a very privileged position. And I recognized my positionality as a white male from a privately educated middle-class background. And I acknowledged the many benefits that I've had that allowed me to be in this position to work out there. And it introduced me to very wonderful teachers and young people who saw personal values as a way of opening up citizenship for them, as a way of attaching meaning to the activities that we did. And when I left the Caucasus and came to practice at the bar, I found that by talking to the people that worked on the project with us 13 years later, they had made many significant and important decisions in their lives around things like their careers, around where they wish to live, and how they wish to engage as citizens that came from things that they could identify on the course. And so I saw that focusing on a personal and cultural approach to citizenship education as something very meaningful. And this tempted me back into research to work on an education doctorate. And so from 2015, I looked at the much more mixed environment at a UK university where citizenship had a more hybrid appearance, where students were influenced by the messages of employability coming from the institution, as well as what they were learning in hidden spaces on campus, namely with their friends. That what they saw as their civic values and norms came from experiences of discussions with friends outside of classes and outside of extracurricular activities. And this was quite significant because those other two areas of civic learning are normally prioritized in the research. And so these two papers that I wrote helped form the basis for the project that I'm going to talk about today. That the experiences of my students on a UK campus were that they felt under pressure. They did not have enough time to explore the things that mattered to them as citizens within the class or within their extracurricular activities, because they were chasing the employability credentials. They knew they had to get a certain grade. They knew they had to fill their CVs. And so it was only in the private spaces that they discussed citizenship. And both the students in the UK and in Azerbaijan found that approaching it through their own personal values as very appealing. And so to set the stage for this current project, if we look globally, the UNESCO Futures of Education Commission looked at some of the challenges that the world faces every 15 to 20 years, every generation, if you will. And their most recent report in 2021 looked at a quite frightening and anxious future involving climate change, advanced technologies, and greater overcrowding and overpopulation. And so the Commission, drawing from many parts of the world, suggested for higher education pedagogies of compassion, empathy, and solidarity as part of what they called transformative human rights education. And this was to help students and then graduates in later life manage some of the inevitable tensions that are going to happen from rapid, complex social change. So this reinforced my commitment to look at the ways in which students could learn these sorts of things through civic and human rights education. And then I looked at my professional context as an EdD researcher. And this is an advertising hoarding from my university, not the one I'm at currently. And they, within the UK, rely on student fees as their main source of revenue. It is a paradigm of the neoliberal higher education model that others may be familiar with from America, Australia, parts of East Asia, and South Africa. That universities promote and advertise themselves to students. And here you can see the theme of identity, promoting themselves as a way that students can have a new identity at the university by attending and completing a degree. Indeed, there's a lot of evidence to show that civic norms and habits are indeed transformed and challenged at university, such as the study by Sloman, a large quantitative study, which drew really clear correlations between civic norms and values being cultivated at university and the experience on the degree. But what these large quantitative studies can't tell us are the particular mechanics and causation within the classroom that might lead to these particular norms and values being formed. Because otherwise, citizenship is not being taught. It's not a recognized discipline at many universities in the UK. However, universities will have global citizenship courses that are intertwined with their business of promoting themselves to students. And so the research on global citizenship education has found them to be affected by the concerns of employability. Come and learn about citizenship. It will help improve your CV is the message. And this certainly was appearing in the studies that I did with my own students. And so there is this tension, and this is a photograph of the protests against the rises in tuition fees in the UK, that the human capital model that, again, many of you may be familiar with from around the world, focusing on the credentials, the employability of graduates, leads to tensions with students coming to university wishing to develop themselves in other ways. And that's why my own students in my scoping study were saying, well, we're exploring our own values in the private spaces, because when we come to class, we're focused on getting the grade. So that led me to think about how I could cultivate the identities and agency of the undergraduates using an exploratory intervention. And the conceptual model that I use for that begins with identity and nests it within agency and within context and structure. That civic identity involves norms and values within a dynamic process changing over time that concerns our position as members of a political community, in other words, a citizen. This in itself exists within our actions as agents that we can learn from the way in which we can achieve and influence things around us, using Amartya Sen idea of agency, that we pursue things which we value. And that in itself is restrained and existing within a context, whether we are growing up with a particular family background, from a particular class, particular ethnicity, and indeed the political economy of where we are. And as we'll see with my students, they were working in a remote part of the UK, mostly white students, and very affected by how their parents had raised them. And this led me to thinking about how I would connect this with human rights. And I turned to Brian Turner's theory of human rights and citizenship, a sociological theory that argues that a democratic citizen can be cultivated through compassion and empathy for excluded others. Because through compassion and empathy for those beyond our community, we can start to expand our moral communities. And so I took this as my theoretical base for connecting citizenship with human rights. So turning to my context in the UK, it was one in which students were, the research, particularly by Hennon Ford's work, showing that they were much more individualized in their participation, filling in online one-off petitions, for example, rather than joining political parties. That it was a much more diverse political community, with particularly through immigration after the Second World War. And it was one in which in the last 10 years, there was officially sanctioned hostility towards people coming in from overseas, whether as migrants or refugees. And so the political decisions I took around this research, I was upfront and transparent with, to be ethical with my students, that I was thinking about the ways in which, from the bottom right-hand photo, a hostility was encouraged towards others. This is an advert that was driven around towns and cities in the UK, reminding people that they would be arrested if they were here illegally. And landlords and employers were asked to check people's immigration status. This was part of what was called the hostile environment. And in the top right corner, a site that many of us in the UK may be familiar with outside our supermarkets of people begging. And the post-economic crash has led to a rise in poverty, particularly through government policies of austerity. And this captured the popular imagination in the film of I, Daniel Blake, where a person had their disability living allowance, their benefits removed in the culture of austerity, and led to his premature death. And I, Daniel Blake, said that he was not a client, a customer, nor a service unit. He wanted to be treated as a citizen, as a human being, a person with dignity. And so this is quite unusual for the UK, that citizenship, which is not part of our political tradition, was so powerfully portrayed in this film, I, Daniel Blake. It won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival in 2016. So I recommend watching it if you haven't seen it. So citizenship seemed to be a relevant theoretical framework for the context that I was in, because it seemed to give voice and recognition and dignity to those in face of power, particularly where many were being excluded because of their socioeconomic difficulties or their perceived race or ethnic background. So I decided to work with transformative education, understood as a way of shaping learners' personal beliefs and their potential for action. And this can lead to participation to make universities and communities more just. And both of these drawing a lot from James Banks's work. And the challenge was whether these research methods would in themselves lead to transformation, or whether it was the students' own perception of the activity. So there's a lot of very good longitudinal research by Paul Ashwin and others suggesting that it's in fact the students' perception, rather than anything that we are deciding in the classroom, that leads to the potential for transformation. And I'm going to be questioning that when we get to the conclusions, because I think that the research methods I used here showed some transformational moments for the participants. So how does this research method bring together human rights education and citizenship education? Well, I used Starkey and others' understanding of pedagogical research, that when we are looking into the forms of learning, we are also teaching and that our students are learning with us. Pedagogical research is both the collection and generation of data and a political and civic activity that allows young people to be heard, where they can explore their own understandings of citizenship and indeed, I would say, human rights. Because we have two common traditions between these two fields. One, on the left-hand side of your screen, where students' lived experience, particularly of injustices in their own communities, is part of transformative human rights education, or citizenship as practice, as the citizenship scholars would call it. And on the right-hand side, giving space, a safe space to distance the participants from those pressures of getting the grades, filling the CV, something, again, that's used in citizenship and human rights education research, particularly at university and Blanchard and Nix's paper. So my method was both research and learning, and something that was common to both these traditions. So what did the design look like? Well, the overall design had three stages. First, allowing students to express where they had come from, their own backgrounds, and to share that with others. And this was using ideas from Paulo Freire to question one's background, to question the influence of social structures, authentic and critical reflection. And this was supported with image theatre, something I'll explain a little bit in the next slide, which helped participants feel less inhibited, helped them get to know one another in the research space, and help them open up about their own personal values and beliefs. And secondly, to put them into somewhere strange, to challenge those social norms using Meserau's ideas of critical incidents, where one's own norms and values would be challenged, and then leading through a process of critical reflection, perhaps even change, as we question the assumptions behind our beliefs. And I would bring them back into the classroom for that critical reflection and use forum theatre as a participatory, active process by which the students would choose the particular human rights and citizenship issues to explore through a theatre play. And that's where they could experiment with any newfound norms and values and use their agency to challenge injustice, and to do it in a safe space, a way in which the classroom was supported by me as a teacher and supported by other students that they'd got to know in the image theatre activities. So a little bit more about image theatre, which might be unfamiliar to many of you. Image theatre, like forum theatre, is from a body of work called Theatre of the Oppressed, developed by Augusto Boal in Brazil in the 1970s and 80s. And it's called participatory theatre because members of the audience can stand up and take part on the stage. Image theatre is not an actual play, it is a series of exercises to prepare people to take part in a play. And these sorts of exercises involve things that you can see in that photograph. This is from a workshop with teachers that I ran after the project. And they are doing an exercise from image theatre called Colombian hypnosis. It's not actual hypnosis, but it involves a person holding out their hand and then slowly bringing their partner around the room and their partner following the hand as it moves. And key to image theatre is you do not talk. You use your body. It is embodiment to express different, to engage in different activities and thereby stand back from whatever social norms might be inhibiting a person. So in this exercise, to explore relationships of trust between strangers and how communication can occur non-verbally. Another exercise I used with students was the power chair, where a person would sit in a chair in the center of the classroom, and then others would join one by one with the aim of taking the power from the person in the chair, which led to discussions of how power is exercised. So image theatre both helps students build relationships within the classroom and also explore things through embodiment. Forum theatre is a way of a group discussing an issue of social justice. It could be road landlords, something that's quite common to students, of which they have experience, actual lived experience. They then devise a scenario with an unhappy ending for a particular protagonist. And then they perform the scene in front of an audience that can relate to it, to challenge members of the audience to see if they can intervene to prevent the injustice from occurring. And that's facilitated by what's called the joker, who helps stimulate discussion after the person has tried to take on the injustice. And this was developed by Augusto Boal as a way of raising questions, not necessarily delivering answers, but raising questions about how social injustice occurs. And what I wanted to do in this activity, in this project, was combine this with experiential learning in the community so that young people would not individualize oppression. Some of the research around forum theatre with young people shows that without knowledge of social injustice or the structures in society that can oppress, they often say, oh, well, that's because they're stupid, or that's because they're just being difficult, without understanding that the housing legislation, for example, places a landlord at an advantage, or that there are particularly oppressive attitudes towards women. So it was important to open up the students' minds through activities in the community so that they could bring in social injustices into that forum theatre that they could relate to. So who were they? It was a group of 11 students, first-year students, and they were a mixture of social science, law, criminology, sociology. They were mostly white, as was the community that we were working in that part of the UK. A mixture of middle, lower class, one international student, one Islamic student, one Christian student, the rest were secular, mainly female. So 8 female, 3 males. And they all spent an average of around about 9.5 hours in the research space, so a range of 8 to 13. They attended every activity for no academic credit. I provided them with lunch, and I encouraged them to join in the first place because it might be helpful for their CV. They told me that they came along because they were very curious and they stayed because they really enjoyed it, and they enjoyed meeting students from other disciplines. And what was very interesting is that they didn't enjoy some of the activities, but they kept coming because they found it very interesting. So we'll see some of that in the data. So let's get to the main part, the data. There were three main themes that came out of this. And when I say data, I was running a series of focus groups at the start and at the finish. I ran a series of interviews at the end. And I also had contemporaneous notes, which I made up after the end of each session. I also asked the participants to provide me with anonymous feedback to say whatever they wished about the activities. And I had report back sessions several months afterwards with the participants to tell them about my findings and ask for their feedback on them. I'm also very grateful for the teaching staff at Plymouth, who also gave me some advice before I started and also discussed some of the findings when I finished. Three main areas. One, the liminality. And this was something that I had not expected at all, that students found stepping back from themselves in the theatre exercises to see themselves, being in a place where they were not in class and not in extracurricular activities, and also being at the edge of their communities. So three types of liminality really helped them open up, led to new experiences which they considered to be valuable. Secondly, they found that encountering others in need led to compassionate experiences, primarily through being present to others and listening to others. That led to changes in questioning their own identities as well as exercising agency. But it's the third part that I'm going to talk a lot about, and that is the method and the mechanics of how this happened, the transformational process. These three areas are going to be three different papers that come out of it. The first one, the third one I'm concentrating on today, and the second one I'm going to be presenting at the conference by the association in April. The first theme within the transformational domain was an emotionally charged or felt sense of citizenship and a critical reflection on what they saw as their communities. So Emma, who was a young lady from a small town in the countryside, where her first experiences of refugees was her father talking at the television saying that they're coming here to take her jobs. So she said that it was very memorable for her to go into someone's house and see that there weren't even any beds. They just had mattresses on the floor and nothing else. And you can see that this was an emotionally charged experience. It was quite upsetting. Yaya was an international student from Indonesia, a Muslim young lady. And when she spent time with a refugee charity, she was very surprised that the refugees were Christian and they were not Muslim, because she said to me, well, I'd seen on television that refugees are all Muslim. And you can see there in the focus group her saying, well, I really want to go and talk to my friends about it. And this is that hidden curriculum of peer-to-peer learning amongst friends at university. And it's one of the limits of the research is I didn't know what the students would talk about after the workshops and in between the workshops. And no doubt if they had these quite powerful experiences, there would have been quite a bit going on when they got home and wanted to talk about what they had seen. May, who was from the city where the university was located, and said that going to the debt crisis clinic was nothing strange for her because she would see people begging on the streets. But what was really new for her was being in the same room as that person and seeing them face to face, what she says as up close and actually talking to them. They were sat right in front of me. And so these emotionally charged experiences that led them to question who they saw as refugees, who they saw as excluded, came out of these face-to-face encounters. And I think, and I'll be commenting later, how this has become even more relevant to me post-COVID, as we spend so much more time in very helpful fora like these, sharing things internationally. But I can't remember having a face-to-face meeting with a personal tutee since COVID. And I certainly have a lot of my meetings online. And so the research perhaps reminds us not to forget that excellent opportunity to learn empathy in face-to-face conversation. Then the other theme around transformation was the humanizing of others. And this was a word that many of the students repeated in their anonymous feedback. So I think they wanted to draw attention to it for me. Alex, a mature student, came back to university after working in a high street bank. And she commented on how the image theatre activities and being in the debt crisis centre, I know she's talking about a homeless person there, led her to think about, well, I forget about the actual people, but they're not just a homeless person or a person that is essentialized and is othered, but they have a background, they have a story. Emma, the young lady that you met in the previous slide, really had some very powerful comments about the refugees she met. And you can see her saying that they were normal people, chatty, friendly, laughed. And here you can see someone giving identity and so dignity to an excluded other. And this was challenging what she had learned in her family within that context in which her civic agency and identity has been learned prior to university. And her admitting that this has altered her perspective on it, although she's not quite sure, I guess. The second major theme around transformation was around forum theatre. And I'm just going to preface this briefly by saying that, and I think this was a very useful method, because I used this method in Azerbaijan as well, to focus the activity around my conceptual framework of choosing something for the forum theatre play that they cared about, something that affected them, and something they felt that they could change. And so it had to be something in the center of that Venn diagram. And as a result, the students chose mental health, pollution, and intolerance of different others. And the group on mental health is the one I'm going to talk about because they had a really compelling play around mental health. And this was their flip chart paper. And you can see here that they are making connections between the various different issues of mental health, social media, loneliness, things that they've experienced themselves at university and things that they've seen in the charities. And so these aren't young people individualizing the oppression, they're seeing it within context. And they're learning from interactions with others. These aren't things that we've studied or read about or had a lecture. They've learned it from peer to peer and from listening to others and talking to others. So I think that that really validates the combination of using participatory theatre with experiential learning. The play concerned a young lady called Delilah, and in the first scene and the second and the third scene, no one had enough time to acknowledge what was going on in her life. She wasn't listened to by her mother, who was too busy on her mobile phone. She was ignored by her peers, who were too busy going out to get drunk. And the personal tutor that she went to see didn't have enough time to listen to her and had to get the next student in because they were under time pressure themselves. And so this sense of exclusion, which they were identifying within the university community, was one of just pushing people away, not listening to others and not acknowledging some of the difficulties that these first year students were having in transitioning to university. And the reactions to it from the performers, May, she performed in the play, feeling this catharsis, this relief to have this question of loneliness being heard and sharing it with others and that they would understand it, and then realizing that others had the same experience. It's not just you, and bringing them together. And Bella, in a completely separate focus group, and she was part of the audience, using those same words, that it's the same thing, like you always think, oh, it's just me. Now, those words that I've highlighted in yellow appear in a very similar form in a transformational learning study by Baumgartner of HIV and AIDS sufferers, and by Errol and others of a study of young people and forum theatre. That this experience of suddenly connecting with others and realizing that you're not alone in your experience of injustice is evident in other studies of transformational learning and forum theatre. And so I think it speaks to ideas of solidarity and senses of collective agency. So to wrap things up, the question was, how are the civic identities and civic agency of undergraduates shaped by this intervention? Well, I'll make 4 general points. One is that they were humanizing those at the edges of their community. They were building social bonds with others within the research space. And they were critically reflecting on oppression in the university and the community. And when I say oppression, many of the the examples that I've spoken of, particularly the play, involved exclusion and misrepresentation of others. And I theorize that these are becomings. And Kaptani and Yuval Davis use this in Study on Foreign Theatre. So becomings are a form of knowledge that emerges from narratives and performances within the research space, comprised of contributions from the participants and myself as a researcher, affecting one another. So it's a reflexive process. And this knowledge is both dialogic, emerging from one-to-one conversations, relational, by how we understand one another and how we fit in and belong, affective, because it's accompanied by emotions, and experiential, that there are moments of embodiment, that they would speak to how image theatre allowed them to see themselves, and experiential in another sense, that there was a sense of trial and error, that they would go out into the community and talk to people and then learn from them and perhaps be corrected by things that they had preconceived notions of before. So I think this speaks to transformative human rights education in some really interesting ways. First of all, coming back to the theoretical base about how human rights or moral communities that respect them can be cultivated through empathy and compassion for the plight of others. And I think this was very relevant for the UK and also for the particular city that I was working in, where there was a high number of asylum seekers, high rates of poverty as well. And this way in which others can see that they're not alone in their experiences can perhaps lead to a shared language and seeing that there are shared moral universes, that people share particular concerns, they share experiences of injustice. And that then led to some of the students saying, well, we'd quite like to form an extracurricular club around this. We'd quite like to all go back and volunteer at the homeless shelter. And if I'd had more time, we would have done more transformative work around how the students wanted to act beyond the research space. So a few practical considerations to finish with. One is comparing the models that Hammond and Keating and Sen analyze, that some universities, certainly my own university, was seeing citizenship as something that would increase employability, that they would ask private companies to choose the issues that students would look at, that would help market the university, and this would achieve certain numbers in terms of involvement and certain projects that had to be met. And then the differences that I would suggest around transformative human rights and citizenship education, the benefits you can see there, staff and students choosing and researching the problems within their own everyday realities, but also being aware of the larger global context. And the difficulty here that this is unpredictable. This might lead to challenging institutional culture, questioning the way things are done, because it will generate new ideas and experiences that you might not expect. So there are some pros and cons. This group did self-select, and a further research question arising from the next cycle of action research is how to engage some students rather than others. And I'm particularly interested in working with more and more young men, as many of my experiences of citizenship and human rights education are often with young women who seem to volunteer. Secondly, how would we work with bigger numbers? It's the reality, the cohort at my law school is 500 plus. And so we're starting a new research project at my institution now of working with larger teams of teachers. And thirdly, how would we find time for this? Would this be something which is better placed in the curriculum when there's contracted time, or should it exist within that liminal space? So I'll finish with this thought that it led me to think of myself differently as an academic citizen, whether I am a researcher, learner, and teacher within this pedagogical space, and whether in doing so to find that time to work with these students, to commit myself to it, is in fact an act of academic citizenship. So I can see I'm over my time, so thank you very much for listening. Thank you again to Audrey and Hugh for this opportunity, and I should also acknowledge that this EdD was supported by many people, not least of whom Hugh, who was one of my supervisors, and Tristan McCowan, who's not here, is not one of my other supervisors.
Thank you very much indeed, Piers. I've read Piers's article in Human Rights Education Review, and I've put the link to it in the chat line. But I have to say that listening to you today really brought that alive to me and helped me understand your work in in a new dimension. So two things do go together, listening to peers and reading peers. So I've understood you much, much more clearly. I've also been very inspired by your very explicit understandings of transformational learning and transformative human rights education, which I don't find all those who are writing about these things are so explicit. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to hand over to Hugh now because Hugh's going to take the questions. And I can see that a couple of people have commented, but don't feel you have to have a beautifully thought out question before you join in. I know it's sometimes quite hard, especially in an international environment like this. So please don't be shy to express yourself. And I'll hand over to Hugh for the Q&A and any comments you might have. Thank you, Piers, and thank you, Hugh.
Well, thanks, Audrey. Yes, I'm Hugh Starkey, and I'm Treasurer of the International Association for Human Rights Education. Piers, can I ask you to stop sharing your screen now, and then we should be able to see everybody who's in the room. And so welcome again to everybody who's here. And this is your opportunity to ask questions of peers. I had a question, so let me dive in first. Piers, the image theatre and the forum theatre clearly had tremendously powerful effects. And you have been described as a lawyer, not necessarily someone who has gone through a traditional teacher training program, although you were doing an Ed.D. So how do you get trained to, how do you manage to get the courage, I would say, to use these very interesting, powerful, but innovative techniques that not every teacher will know about?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I was fascinated by particularly powerful moments of learning. Were there particular methods that I could use in the classroom that would really enhance the learning for my students? And I saw forum theatre being used when I was working in citizenship education in Azerbaijan. And I found it easy to use, that young Azerbaijani school children would take it and run with it and write all these wonderful stories, which were very relevant. So I saw a play about how a school pupil was treated unfairly in a disciplinary process. And that was put on at a secondary school in Sumgait in Azerbaijan. And so they didn't need a lot of resources to do it. The process is quite simple and straightforward. But as you said, Hugh, it does take some courage as a teacher to enter into those spaces where you're not sure quite what's going to happen. And I would say that with forum theatre, it's not something to be taken lightly. If you're asking your participants to draw on their own lived experience, it will inevitably give quite an emotional content to what's happening, which I think is welcome. But it does mean that you as a facilitator do need to hold the classroom. And I'm sure many experienced teachers here will know what I mean about holding the group, is thinking of noticing the group in a way in which you need to preface and prepare them for what they're going to go into, and to bring them down afterwards after the activity. So finding moments where they can just simply talk and express what had happened without being within the activity. Moments for pause, moments for silence, moments where you take a break. And also discussing particular norms that you want the class, that you think the group should have. So invite the group, if you're going to talk about domestic abuse, for example, what are the particular ways in which you want the group to discuss it, and for them to decide their own rules around it. So with forum theatre, Boal was quite explicit. There isn't a set formula. It's something that people can pick up and use without a book per se. but it is something in which you should be mindful of the emotional content for the students. For image theatre, it's a lot simpler. These are just a whole series of games and activities which Boal created, and I'll put the link in the chat to the book that he wrote called Games for Actors and Non-Actors. Sorry, one of the many books that he wrote. And that contains about, I think, 40 to 50 different image theatre activities. Each one is about half a page. And they range from the things to simply build trust amongst a group, to identify oppression, to look at social misrepresentation and stereotypes. There's all sorts of games and activities for different moments. But I think, just coming back to your question again, Hugh, that you're stepping into that place where I think it's Michalina Sembelias, if I pronounce his name correctly, talks about pedagogies of discomfort, that we move into a space where we will be uncomfortable. And so being prepared to be mindful of that as ourselves and also with our participants. If anyone wants to talk to me individually about how to do it, I'd be happy to talk at greater length after today. Thanks,
Piers. That's great. It's possible there's no. I can't see any further questions in the chat. If you would like to ask a question of Piers, can you just put your artificial hand out? So Janet has put her hand up. Janet, can you unmute yourself and ask your question?
All right, thank you. And greetings everyone from Pretoria, South Africa. It's so good to see you. Hi, Audrey. So we have a similar project, and if you see from the abstract that I submitted for the conference in April, when I saw your presentation, I was like, oh my God, we are doing the same thing, but from our side, we're using arts and human rights. So it's not as advanced as what you are doing, but we also just go beyond teaching human rights within the black letters of the law to go to the art gallery, and through the artworks that we have at the gallery, we use it to identify patterns of migration where art that was from the Ashanti Kingdom in Ghana looks almost like the same one from Makbunguve in South Africa. And these are two distinct artworks that are created in different regions of Africa, just making the case that it is possible that they must have been an earlier cross migration between these people. So migration is not truly a new concept even within Africa. And I think from our standpoint, we do it just to, create awareness for xenophobia, which is a rife concept in South Africa. But just hearing generally that you are doing almost the same thing, just gives me real hope that we're also doing something which is really good. And I think mostly I don't really have a comment. I also just wanted to talk about our work and also say that I like the way you structured your work, and I'm going to copy some of it in my article and I'll cite you properly, but I really appreciate you just presenting your work, and it shows that what you guys were doing there was really something very commendable. So I just wanted to say it. Yeah, so thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Janet.
you very much,
That's
Janet.
Really great to hear that. Piers, I don't know if you want to react to that or wait for another question.
Janet, I'd love to hear more. And thank you for your impressions on what we're doing. And my email is available on the Birmingham City site, and I'll try and get in touch with you. But I'd really like to learn about what you're doing.
I've already sent you a request on LinkedIn, so we can connect there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Janet.
Yeah.
So is there anybody else who'd like to engage with Piers and ask a question? Ava, yes. Can you unmute yourself?
Is this better?
Yeah.
Hi, we can hear you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Piers, for your presentation. It was very interesting. I was thinking about, as you mentioned in one of the last slides, that this was participants who have chose to go into this project. So they might be more open to also maybe see perspectives from other people's side, or if you have a classroom where they did not, you know, choose to make these kind of activities, how would you think of, I mean, now you have seen that it could increase empathy, this kind of actions. But I think if you do not accept to go into them, this may not be the effect.
Yes. So I can see that. So when I tried experiential activities before, when I first was working on them in Azerbaijan with university students, I had a student stand up and walk out the class and say, I don't think that this is what a university classroom is for. I have to say that I haven't encountered that very much, partly because one might say that I've been working with people that volunteer to be in the classroom, but I also think that the ones that have come to the classroom always stay. And that is because I think that there are aspects of this which are attractive to young people within that age range, namely self-discovery, experimentation, learning about others, because there's always that tension at that age about wanting to fit in and wanting to be different. And so they can find it very engaging. But you're absolutely right, Eva. How you present this to others, how you present this to potential participants is very important to encouraging them to take part. And it's also, as I think perhaps you're also suggesting, to be cognizant, to be aware that if this is a compulsory course that students have to complete, how are you going to walk them through activities that they might be unfamiliar with? And I think you can stage it. I wouldn't sort of throw them straight in at the deep end with forum theatre, but there are ways in which you can present it to appeal to the things in which students want to achieve. So I still think that Paul Ashwin's work, I haven't sort of disproven that at all. It's absolutely right that students engage with it if they can see benefits for their particular personal project at university. So understanding why students are there in the first place, what they want to achieve, and trying to find ways in which the activities that you're running will benefit the things that they want to achieve, and appealing to their self-interest. And that's an area that I'm now working on. This particular project was very small, very in-depth, and it's led to the question that you've posed, Eva. And I hope to come back maybe in a year's time with some better answers of engaging, for me, particularly young men in this type of work.
Thanks. Tammy has raised her hand. Tammy, are you able to unmute? Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. And again, thanks to Piers for a very insightful presentation. I'm actually sitting in The Hague, the Netherlands, and I work at a university here. We just completed an e-course with some other European universities in which we talk about using stories as a way to have more inclusive educational environments. And I'm interested in hearing from you a little bit about your experience with just designing the, like about what to do to design something like this if you want to start it off as a new type of an experience. And from the point of view of that the university that we're in would be much more interested in something that gets students so-called ready for the job market. So like what you were explaining, you know, what types of steps to take to maybe sell it so as something that also is important.
Okay, so two things, Tammy. Thank you very much for your question. And I'd love to talk more after today if we can get in touch. If we want to sort of just
I will send you a LinkedIn. That was a good idea from
if we can help each other. So the first thing is the stories. So I found talking to students first the best thing to do, because I found quite little research on the the actual experiences that students have at universities. In the UK, we have a much more diverse body now. We have mature students. We have students that never would have been at university 10, 15, 20 years ago. And we have a university environment which has transformed. A lot of it is online. A lot of it, as you said, is geared around employability. And so I thought the best thing to do was just to talk to them first and understand what their experiences were and what their interests were. Because then it comes back to, was it Janet's point or Eva's question about finding activities that appeal to them. And you can't find those activities if you don't know what appeals to them in the first place.
Right.
And then the second thing about employability is what I'm finding by talking to the employability department in my university is they're actually on quite a similar page to me, that working around identities is very important for employability. And some of the people I've spoken to are a little bit sort of conscious that they are sort of being very corporate about this, that almost treating the university like a job center when it's not. So I think you might find a receptive audience for those in employability that might want to work with you. But even if you don't, there's a lot in this type of activity that's beneficial for students that want to make something of themselves in later life. It helps cultivate autonomy. It helps cultivate self-awareness, social awareness. And one of the areas that I'm going to be looking at in our next study is the ways in which this sort of activity is actually complementary to what the university wants to achieve. Because after all, these are our jobs, this is our revenue. We can't change that framework.
Yeah.
And so
Thanks.
one of the very first things you might be asked in a job interview is, well, why are you here? Why is it you want to do these things? And so understanding identity and things like that through these sorts of activities could have benefits elsewhere.
I'd like to just get Edwina an opportunity to ask her question before we finish.
Hi, Piers. Thank you so much for that extremely inspiring presentation. Something that's very close to my heart, participatory action research. I'm thinking about social cohesion and community, not necessarily being in the elite environment of a university, but in a community. Would you see your work as being something transferable that could be within a social community project, or would you see it as too complex?
Definitely in the sense that there are a lot of community organizations that use forum theatre all over the world. You'll find them in India, Africa, South America, obviously, because it's from Brazil, as well as the more sort of well-endowed sort of organizations of Western Europe and America. And it's used to educate, it's used on the street. And there are various forms of theatre of the oppressed that can be used where just simply don't have a lot of resources. And so if you're in a community environment where you don't have that, it can be very flexible. So yes, this definitely overlaps with the sorts of things that NGO and other civil society groups do.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Edwina. Thanks, Piers. There are a couple of other comments in the chat. I think we'll have to leave them. I think Audrey wants to just close with some announcements. So at this point, I will say thank you very much to Piers. You will see from the comments in the chat that your presentation has been hugely appreciated, a model of clarity, but also very inspiring. So thank you, Piers. And Audrey, final word or two?
Yes, I think I'd like to read out part of Maria's comment to finish with. Maria says that she thanks you, but then she goes on to say, with the rise of authoritarianism, polarization and alienation in diverse society, these approaches you have illuminated today provide hopeful pedagogical approaches that invite young people into transformative learning experiences that reverberate in shared communities in meaningful ways. I can't think of a nicer way to sum up the context in which we're working, but also to encourage all of you who are here. Some of you have not yet joined our association. Please do consider joining. We do need your support, both in person coming along and joining in, but also in financially, if you can manage it. to support the organisation with a subscription of £50. And we do also stress again that you are most welcome. Come and join us in London on the 19th of April. We can't offer that session online because it's just too expensive, too complex to do. But if you're looking for support to your institution and you find that your institution says you have to present a paper, although all the slots are now closed, we are open to welcoming you if you need that support by presenting a poster at that conference. So we really hope to see you on the 19th of April. If you can't make it to London, please do seriously consider joining the association and supporting events like this and the journal, which a number of people here have contributed to. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming along this evening, and we hope to keep in touch through our association, through our journal, and through future events like this. Thank you.